My name is David Miller. I am 45 years old, and this is not just my story. It is a story of my son, Ethan, who taught me the true meaning of resilience and the heavy cost of betrayal. Ethan had always been a bright child. He was never the loudest in the classroom, never the one trying to grab everyone's attention. Instead, he was thoughtful, creative, and meticulous. From a young age, he dreamed of becoming an engineer. His notebooks were filled with sketches of machines, bridges, and inventions that he hoped one day would change the world. As his father, I encourage him, even when others dismiss his scribbles as childish fantasies. I believed in him with all my heart. And when the time came for him to present his first big project in high school, a robotics competition that could open doors to scholarships and opportunities, I thought the world would finally see what I had always known. But I was wrong. That day, in front of his classmates and teachers, Ethan's robot malfunctioned. A minor technical error caused the entire system to freeze. His presentation fell apart before his very eyes. Instead of encouragement, he was met with laughter. The auditorium echoed with cruel chuckles, whispered insults, and even loud jeers. "Nice toy, Ethan," someone yelled. "Guess you're not as smart as you thought," another mocked. Even his teacher, Mr. Clarkson, smirked under his breath, offering only a half-hearted, "Maybe better luck next time." I watched from the back of the room, my fists clenched so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My son, who had worked nights and weekends perfecting his design, stood on stage trembling, not from fear, but from humiliation. When we drove home that evening, he was silent. His eyes stared out the window, but I could see the reflection of his tears. I wanted to say something comforting, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I put my hand on his shoulder, silently promising him that this moment would not define him. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, his classmates turned his failure into a running joke. They mimicked the robot freezing, stumbling around the hallways like broken machines. They called him Glitch Boy and Error Ethan. Even his so-called friends distanced themselves, afraid of being mocked by association. The worst part? His teacher, Mr. Clarkson, allowed it. Sometimes he even chuckled along. A grown man, entrusted with guiding young minds, encouraging ridicule instead of compassion. It broke Ethan. One night, I found him in his room, his notebooks torn apart, crumpled sketches littering the floor. His once bright eyes were dull. He whispered to me, "Dad, maybe I'm just not good enough." Those words pierced me like a blade. I hugged him tightly and said, "You are more than enough, Ethan. You don't fail because you're not capable. You fail because you're brave enough to try. And trying again is what makes a man stronger than anyone else." But inside, my heart burned. I knew I couldn't let this go. Not because my pride was hurt, but because the system, the students, the teachers, even the environment, had conspired to crush a boy who simply dared to dream. At that moment, I decided I would stay silent, observe, and gather everything I needed. Because when I struck back, it wouldn't just be loud, it would be devastating. That was the day my quiet watch began. I stayed quiet, just like I had promised myself. Quiet not because I was powerless, but because impulsive action would ruin everything. Revenge that is loud and clumsy solves nothing. It only feeds their gossip and gives them time to prepare. So I watched. I listened. I learned the pattern of cruelty that surrounded Ethan, who said what, who laughed, and who encouraged the jeers. Ethan retreated inward for a while. He stopped entering competitions, stopped sharing his designs even with me. He locked his notebooks in a drawer and avoided the robotics lab. I could see the light leaving him. That hurt more than anything. I couldn't let the education system or the lazy, vindictive classmates win like this. First, I started with small things. I talked to the parents of Ethan's classmates under the pretense of ordinary conversation. I asked about school events, about group projects, about teachers who pushed or ignored students. I met a few at the grocery store, at the community center, at PTA meetings. Most of them were the kind who smiled and moved on. A few, however, dropped little, careless remarks. "Kids these days don't have the grit," one father said. "If they fail, they learn faster." Another laughed in a tone that left no room for empathy. Next, I watched the school from afar. I volunteered to help at the library and signed up for every event where parents were needed. It gave me a front row seat to how the staff behaved. Occasionally, I intercepted pieces of gossip, half-formed and poisonous. But the breakthrough didn't come from eavesdropping. It came from a simple email. One evening, while browsing through some old messages on Ethan's old laptop, we were trying to restore his motivation slowly. Remember, I found an automated notification from the robotics club. It alerted Ethan to a mentoring session, and it was addressed to Ethan Miller, robotics team member. The timestamp was from the week before his public failure. Above that, buried in the thread, was a short message from someone named C. Hayes, a student I didn't recognize. The message contained a link to an online module. Curious, I clicked it. What I found was a hacked version of the club system. Someone had uploaded a corrupted script that would, under certain conditions, inject a freeze in the robot control sequence. The script was subtle. It looked like a benign patch to reduce latency. In reality, it triggered a timing error when combined with a specific configuration, the same configuration Ethan had chosen. The script's file name included Clarkson_patch_v2. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. Could a teacher be involved? Was this an accidental bug? I read every message in that thread carefully. Hidden in fragmented replies and private comments was a conversation between a student named Connor Hayes and an account linked to Mr. Clarkson's assistant email. The tone was joking, flippant. Let's see if the new patch will teach him humility. One reply read. Another, from the assistant, had a laughing emoji. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. This was not a malfunction of fate. It was sabotage. The evidence pulled at 1,000 threads. Why would a teacher sabotage a student? What did Connor have to gain? Who else knew? I decided not to confront anyone yet. If I accused him wrongfully, I would ruin Ethan further. I needed proof that could not be dismissed as a coincidence or a misdirected email. For the next 2 weeks, I built my case like a craftsman. I learned how to read metadata, how to trace IP addresses, and how to check file histories. I stayed up late in our study, thumbed through online forums, watched tutorials, and spoke to an old friend from college, Marcus, who worked in IT. Marcus, now a systems analyst, owed me a favor from back when I helped him move apartments 20 years ago. I called him one night and told him the barest sketch of what I suspected. Marcus agreed to help a private server quietly under the guise of offering to review school systems for a community project. He gained limited access to the robotics club's repository. He found what I had found, and more. The Clarkson_patch_v2 file had been uploaded from a desktop inside the teacher's lounge. It bore the digital footprint of someone who used the school's network. Connor Hayes' account had been used to comment, but Connor wasn't the originator. The commit log showed edits made from the same terminal that accessed the teacher portal. The next surprise came in the form of a message Marcus forwarded to me. It was an old disciplinary note about Connor Hayes, a student who was, all the adults had assumed, too good at charming teachers. He had been reprimanded once for cheating on small tests. Mr. Clarkson had written a scolding remark in the report. That tranche of data suggested motive. Connor had grudge against Ethan, or perhaps against ethics, and had found an ally who would rather punish than mentor. But why would a teacher collude? Money? Pride? Protection? I dug further. Marcus pulled the teacher's old performance reviews, parent complaints, and salary history. On the surface, Mr. Clarkson was a respectable man, tenured, well-liked by some parents, a few awards under his belt. Underneath, the picture changed. He had been passed over for a promotion in favor of a younger teacher. He had jotted bitter comments in private. And then there was an email chain Marcus intercepted, one where Clarkson dismissed a student's invention as amateur and joked that mediocrity needs a nudge. It was casual cruelty disguised as educational rigor. Armed with digital breadcrumbs, I then needed human confirmation. I began to talk to kids who had stopped associating with Ethan, not as a confrontational father, but as someone trying to revive the club's spirit. I offered to sponsor snacks during meetings. I brought pastries and a willingness to listen. Teenagers are unpredictable but porous. They like to talk when they are comfortable. Connor Hayes, unsurprisingly, did not open up. He kept his distance, swaggering as if the ridicule he'd lent had elevated him. But another student, Maya, a quiet girl with an eye for circuits, took a liking to Ethan the weeks after the failure. She confessed that she'd seen something unusual. Mr. Clarkson had come into the lab late one evening under the pretense of helping calibrate the equipment. Maya said she saw him hovering near Ethan's bench and that she remembered him laughing softly as Ethan left early one afternoon. Maya's testimony was shaky, young, afraid of senior staff, and prone to second thoughts. But combined with the digital evidence, it fit like pieces of a puzzle. Marcus and I compared timestamps. Mr. Clarkson's late-night visit coincided with the upload of the corrupted script. Maya's memory supported the timing. The teacher's assistant account had commented. Connor had encouraged. Someone higher in the chain had to be responsible. One night, after we thought we had enough, I went to the school with Marcus. We were careful. We didn't break in. We had legal access through a community audit request Marcus filed in the name of the PDA. Schools don't like unannounced audits, especially ones that threaten reputations, so the admin was puzzled but allowed limited access. In the file archives, Marcus found an old draft of the club's upgrade plan that had been deleted and restored several times. The restore log showed the same terminal origin, and in a folder labeled teacher_notes, a subfile named confidential_feedback contained a line that made my blood run cold. We'll teach him that not everyone gets to play with real tools. That was not a line of mentorship. That was a vow. At this point, the network of culpability had narrowed. Connor Hayes and Mr. Clarkson were collaborators, and the network had allowed a student's humiliation to be the point of entertainment rather than concern. I had the digital path. I had a hesitant eyewitness in Maya, and I had a motive that made sense. Arrogance, a desire to keep the established order, and the excitement of seeing a bright kid stumble. But suspicion is not justice. I needed a plan to expose them in a way that couldn't be shrugged off as conspiracy theory. Face-to-face accusations would fail. The school would circle the wagons. Parents would take sides. I had to resort to a method they would least expect. A demonstration that turned their own systems against them, but without harm to anyone. I needed proof displayed publicly, undeniable and merciless in its logic. That's when an idea bloomed that was equal parts simple and cruelly elegant. If the corrupted script was a tool of humiliation, then the remedy would be to use the same channels to show exactly how it worked, without destroying anything. We would simulate the failure, but in a controlled, transparent environment, then reveal the tampering logs live, in front of people who mattered. The PDA, school administrators, parents, the regional education board, and the local press. To do that, I needed three things. Access the system again with traceable logs, a demonstration setup that would replicate Ethan's configuration, and a public forum where the evidence could not be swept away. Marcus prepared a clean replica of Ethan's robot code and set up a sandbox environment that showed the same timing error when the corrupted patch was introduced. He documented each step, took screenshots, recorded terminal logs, and created a timeline file that showed how the attack had been composed. Maya, who had grown protective of Ethan, agreed to stand by us and testify about Clarkson's visit. A quiet math teacher, Mrs. Ainsley, who often had privately chastised Clarkson's coldness, overheard our plans and offered to help organize a PDA meeting where the demonstration could take place as an agenda item. Everything hinged on one risk. If we expose our plan too early, Clarkson or Connor might delete the logs or create false backtraces. So we moved slowly, securing backups and mirrored copies of every incriminating file. We printed copies, encrypted them, and stored them in multiple places. I felt for the first time since Ethan's humiliation that the balance had started to shift. Through the weeks of gathering, Ethan began inching back. He watched me in silence as I worked, eyes flicking to the screen when Marcus and I pored over logs. One evening he asked, softly, "Are we going to make them sorry?" I hesitated. This was not about cruelty. It was about truth and restoration. We will make sure they can't laugh without hearing the truth. I told him. On the morning before the demonstration, I sat across from Ethan at our kitchen table. For the first time in months, he looked like the boy who had drawn bridges and machines in the margins. "If this goes wrong," he said, "I don't want anyone to be hurt." His compassion surprised me. It steadied me. No one will be hurt. I promised. We're only going to show the pattern of their cruelty. People decide how to respond. That night, as I lay awake planning the reveal, I realized how far I had already come from the man who had sat silently in an auditorium weeks ago. Silence had been my strategy, but it had not been submission. I had been forging an argument in the dark. Evidence, witnesses, and a setting where truth could not be dismissed. The table was being set. Now I only needed the players to take their seats. The morning of the demonstration felt like the hush before an ocean storm. I woke early, hours before sunlight crested the rooftops, and brewed coffee I barely tasted. Ethan padded into the kitchen in his slippers, hair still mussed from sleep. He gave me a small, uncertain smile that looked older than his years. Marcus arrived with a laptop bag that smelled faintly of solder and late nights. Maya came a few minutes later, quiet but steady. Mrs. Ainsley had organized the PDA room and filled the table with official-looking nameplates. There was an uneasy electricity in the air that made my hands tremble just a little. We had practiced everything twice. The sequence Marcus would run, the moment Maya would stand up, the line Mrs. Ainsley would use to introduce the agenda. Our script was technical, clinical, and unarguable. A replication of the failure, followed by the logs that pointed to the patch, and then the commit history that traced the upload to a terminal used by the teacher's portal. We had copies printed, encrypted backups, screenshots, and a timeline that fit on a single sheet of paper. The only thing we could not control was the human reaction. By 9, the PDA room was full. Parents, administrators, a scattering of teachers, and a few regional board members had gathered under the polite pretense of a systems review. I could see Mr. Clarkson through the glass, calm, composed, wearing his usual gray blazer. He looked as if nothing unsettled him. Connor Hayes lingered near the door with a group of friends, their smirks already in place like masks. Mrs. Ainsley began the meeting with a veneer of small talk. "We're here to ensure the robotics club is healthy and supportive," she said. "Mr. Miller has agreed to show us some concerns he's raised about unfair practices." Her voice was careful. That phrase, unfair practices, made more eyes turn toward me than anything else had in weeks. Marcus initiated the demonstration. He connected his laptop to projector and walked the room through Ethan's original configuration. He opened code files of methodical, almost ceremonial precision, explaining what each module did. He then introduced the patch into the sandbox. The code behaved exactly as expected. The simulated robot stalled at the same critical second, the graceful motion stuttering into a frozen pose. There was a murmured intake of breath across the room. Then Marcus began to show the logs. One by one, terminal entries scrolled across the screen. Timestamps, IP addresses, user agents. I watched faces change from polite curiosity to uneasy recognition. I felt my stomach fall when Marcus clicked to reveal a commit message. Final calibration. Clarkson _patch _V2. The room grew suddenly small. Mr. Clarkson's composure wavered. He shifted in his seat, fingers tightening on his tablet. Maya stood and told her story. Her voice was low but certain. She described seeing Mr. Clarkson in the lab late at night, the way he lingered by Ethan's bench, the soft, dismissive laugh she'd heard. She admitted to feeling afraid of speaking up earlier. "I didn't think anyone would listen," she said, and then looked at Ethan like she had passed him a salvational note. Connor's friends muttered. Mr. Clarkson cleared his throat and offered an explanation thin as tissue paper. "I was reviewing equipment. Parents, I would never." His sentence collapsed under its own weight when Marcus presented the administrative access logs that matched the terminal origin. The timestamp dovetailed with the upload. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence. The principal, Ms. Delgado, attempted to regain control. "We must be careful. These are serious accusations." Her tone was neutral, protective of process. "We'll investigate formally." But the formal investigation line is often where truth goes to die in bureaucracies. I felt a cold fear at the thought that evidence might be stowed away, that files could be altered or access could be withheld. So I did the one thing I hadn't planned to do. I called in the press. It wasn't typical for a PDA meeting to have a local reporter in the back row, but the presence of a reporter, invited diplomatically by Mrs. Ainsley's casual acquaintance, changed the stakes. With cameras rolling outside the room and a small microphone catching our words, the claim shifted from a private complaint to a public scandal. That was exactly the point. Institutions are less likely to bury facts when light is poised to fall upon them. When Marcus finished, the room erupted into questions. Parents demanded answers. Teachers shifted uneasily. Mr. Clarkson, whose swagger usually dressed like a man untouchable, looked suddenly human, defensive, fearful, clutching at explanations that sounded rehearsed. "I never intended to harm a student," he said finally, voice thin. "It was meant to be a lesson." The choice of the word, lesson, felt like bile in my mouth. I stood and addressed the room, my throat dry and steady. I didn't speak to spite. I spoke to fix the fracture. "You claim to teach, to mentor," I said, "but you sabotaged a child's opportunity to learn and humiliated him in front of his peers. The logs, the timestamps, and the witness are not interpretations. They are facts." Ms. Delgado announced an immediate administrative leave for Mr. Clarkson, pending a formal investigation. The decision landed like a gavel strike, a small victory that felt razor-sharp. Connor Hayes was suspended from the club, pending review. Those reactions did not satisfy me entirely. There were more layers, more people who had laughed and egged on the cruelty, but they were the first chinks in a system that had seemed unimpeachable. Outside the PDA room, the reporters' camera lights felt intrusive and exposing. We gave statements. I kept my words measured. Ethan stood beside me, and I could see the cautious hope in his posture. The story hit the local news by that evening. Allegations of teachers sabotage rock Central High Robotics Club. The headline had a raw, pulpy ring to it, but the consequences were real. Ms. Delgado announced a temporary review board. The Regional Education Authority sent notice. Community forums lit up with polarized debate. Parents took sides. Some defended Clarkson as a stern mentor who had been misunderstood. Others demanded justice for a humiliated child. In the days that followed, the school's PR team went to work smoothing edges. Emails circulated promising transparency. Mr. Clarkson offered a statement of regret, but not an apology. Regret and apology rarely coincide in men who wish to hold on to dignity. Connor's parents defended their son publicly, claiming teenage mischief had been blown out of proportion. The community was becoming a pressure cooker of opinion. Our victory was partial and uneasy. Small reprisals followed. Anonymous notes left in the Miller family mailbox, messages that suggested we had ruined innocent lives. Ethan received cold shoulders in the hallway from students who had once called him names. The cruelty didn't evaporate with the administrative action. It shifted forms, recalibrated to be less explicit and therefore harder to pin down. People who had laughed now pretended forgetfulness. They spoke of learning experiences and growing pains. During all of this, I kept returning to the commit logs and the file paths. One breadcrumb gnawed at me, an obscure subdirectory in the server that didn't belong to Clarkson or Connor. It contained a handful of files marked legacy_support. The file dates were old, predating the recent uploads. It suggested the patch had roots deeper into the school system. Someone had planned a mechanism that could be used again, and maybe had been used before. I took that breadcrumb to Marcus. He frowned, then said quietly, "This could mean a pattern, or an earlier incident that was fixed quietly." The thought made my blood run cold. How many kids might have been quietly humiliated under the auspices of a lesson? One night, exhausted, I opened Ethan's old notebooks. They were not merely sketches anymore. They were decorations of a boy's soul. A pencil drawing of a suspension bridge held together by mathematics. A blueprint for a tiny robotic arm annotated with notes about torque and balance. In the margins, Ethan had scrawled a phrase that made me ache. Build something that won't break. It became my quiet vow. But even as we celebrated the small public victory, I realized I had miscalculated one variable. The one human factor you can never fully quantify. Public exposure had speeded up events, but it had also panicked the people who felt cornered. In their panic, desperate moves often follow. Files deleted, witnesses intimidated, explanations massaged. I had to be quicker, smarter, and more meticulous than I had even imagined. That realization set me back at my kitchen table late that night, staring at the glow of Marcus's laptop. The storm had arrived. Yes, but storms are tricky. They can clear the air or level the house. I had started a process I could not stop, and I would not let it be hijacked or minimized. For Ethan, for every quiet kid whose talents had been scoffed at, for truth. And so I began the next phase, not just exposing what had been done, but making sure it could not be done again, systematically, publicly, and in a way that left no comfortable hiding space for people who had worn cruelty like a uniform. After the PDA, meeting the world felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because the first layer of injustice had been peeled back. Heavier because peeling had revealed something deeper, a network of complacency and quiet cruelty that looked alarmingly like tradition. The administrative leave and suspensions were only the beginning. The real fight would be in the slow, clinical rooms of hearings, interviews, and depositions where truth is either validated or smothered by procedure. The district appointed an investigator, a woman named Claire Reyes, who introduced herself to us with an even voice and a stack of legal pads. She asked the right questions, the kind you can't fake. Who else knew? Timeline, please. Who had motive? Who benefited? Her competence comforted me. Marcus and I handed over everything we had, logs, backups, screenshots, witness statements from Maya, Mrs. Ainsley's notes. Ethan sat beside me during the first interview, his fingers worrying at the hem of his sleeve like he used to do when building prototypes. I watched him breathe in and out, trying to be steady. Claire moved quickly. She subpoenaed certain files and asked for access logs going back years. That request, more than anything else, raised the alarm in the school's administration. Emails started to be guarded. Old server backups were missing. IT staff suddenly claimed ignorance. People who had been coyly indifferent now moved to protect a system that had protected them. That protection had a face. Mr. Whitmore, the district's IT director, a man with a soft smile and a longer history at the district than many of the buildings themselves. His name surfaced in the metadata, like a shadow you can't ignore. Marcus dug into Whitmore's access patterns. Whitmore's account had been used, intermittently, to perform maintenance on the robotic server. Those maintenance windows coincided with a handful of small incidents over the years, robot glitches, unexplained lost files, a student's project corrupted then closed without fuss. On paper, they were anomalies. In context, they began to look like a pattern. Marcus found the faint echoes of deleted commit messages, fragments referencing behavioral checks and keeping kids grounded. The language was chillingly paternalistic. One evening, as I leafed the printed logs, a yellowed news clipping fell out of a folder Marcus had handed me. It was from 7 years prior, a short local piece about a bright student, a scholarship lost after an inexplicable disqualification. The article quoted a teacher praising real-world humility. The name of the student was smudged in the paper, but the year matched the older timestamps we had found. Someone had quietly buried inconvenient stories for a long time. That discovery changed the shape of my plan. It was no longer about punishing a single man for a single act of cowardice. It was about dismantling a culture that preferred to humiliate talent rather than nurture it. If Whitmore and a protective network had been complicit, the stakes were now district level. I realized we needed legal muscle. We hired a lawyer, not to be vengeful or theatrical, but to harness the machinery of justice that could force transparency. Her name was Aisha Khan, an attorney known for taking on public institutions. She had represented teachers, parents, and the occasional whistleblower. Aisha's strategy was meticulous. Open discovery requests broad enough to flush out records, subpoena key personnel, and petition for an independent audit of the district's IT and disciplinary archives. As she worked, the pushback intensified. Mr. Whitmore's defenders emerged first as polite emails questioning the scope of Aisha's requests. The school board convened closed sessions. Anonymous op-eds appeared in community forums, characterizing our actions as disruptive and anti-educational. There was a local Facebook group that suddenly championed Mr. Clarkson as a tough teacher who prepares kids for life. Those who benefit from systems rarely give them up without noise. Then came the personal pressure. Connor Hayes' family hired a lawyer and started whispering that Ethan's humiliation had been mutual, alleging he had sabotaged his own equipment to garner sympathy. Anonymous messages accusing me of orchestrating a smear campaign arrived on our voicemail. Someone painted our car in the school parking lot with a crude message. The cowardice that had once been performed behind smirks now took up more active forms. But beneath the confusion, fragments of truth kept surfacing. Under legal pressure, Whitmore's team produced backups that had been recovered only after Aisha's subpoena. In those recovered archives, Marcus spotted a log entry that had been mislabeled, an old maintenance script that included a comment in Whitmore's own words. It read, in part, behavioral calibration, maintain hierarchy. There was the same paternalistic language, but from a man who signed the checks. We confronted Whitmore through Aisha in a deposition. He answered with a practiced calm that bordered on arrogance. We sometimes had to remind students of expectations, he said, hands folded like a man auditioning for empathy. Under oath, however, the veneer cracked. Aisha, precise and relentless, peeled back layers of excuses until the answers no longer fit together. Whitmore admitted to authorizing behavioral scripts years ago, claiming they were designed to test robustness and teach perseverance. His disclaimers were thin when juxtaposed with a pattern of incidents that had befallen bright, ambitious students. When the deposition footage leaked to the local news, community outrage swelled. Parents wept on live television. Former students came forward with small, similar stories, sabotage projects, unexplained failures, teachers who would scoff at ambition. The narrative shifted from an isolated humiliation to a systemic problem. Our small victory at the PDA meeting had flamed into a movement, but I had to be careful. Public shaming felt righteous. Legal ruin felt final. Our objective was accountability and reform, not the theatrical destruction of reputations. I wanted policies rewritten, oversight committees created, and restitution for those whose opportunities had been stolen. Ethan deserved his chance back in a clean, honest way. Amid the legal battle, something unexpected happened. A quiet, personal reconciliation started to unfold between Ethan and some of the students who had mocked him. Not all of them. Pride and fear are long-lived. But few came to me privately, their faces flushed with shame. One night, a boy named Daniel, one of the louder jokers in the auditorium that day, knocked on our door. He came with his mother and apologized, hands trembling. He said he'd been pressured by Connor into laughter, that he had known Clarkson encouraged certain lessons, and that guilt had eaten at him. He asked if there was anything he could do to help. I told him the only thing that mattered was honesty moving forward. Daniel later agreed to testify about the culture of laughter and the ways kids were groomed to join in. That small human moment reminded me of the difference between revenge and restoration. I had started out wanting to make people pay. As time passed, I realized my purpose had evolved. I wanted to create a safeguard so that no other child's dream would be ground beneath someone else's amusement. As the district's cover started to unwind, another twist emerged, one I hadn't anticipated. Someone within the administration reached out to me anonymously through a paper note slipped under my door. The note was short. Meet me at the old library, 9 p.m. I have records you haven't seen. S. My heart leapt and then sank. Anonymous informants can be traps. They can also be the final piece you need. Marcus urged caution. Aisha said it could be dangerous and advised we go with counsel. We went. The old library smelled of dust and memory. S. turned out to be a middle-aged woman who had worked in the district's archives for decades. Shelley Patel. She had kept a folder of printed records, a closet of things that didn't fit official narratives. She slid out a stack of yellowing memos that tied Whitmore's behavioral calibration to a grant-funded initiative years earlier, one whose budget had been funneled through an educational nonprofit that, on paper, promoted character building. The money trail led to workshops and consultants whose names resurfaced in the margins of memo threads referencing discipline via challenge. Shelley's records included one particularly damning file, an internal audit note that called the initiative controversial and recommended oversight, but the note had been stamped and shelved, never acted upon. Someone had decided the optics of success outweighed the ethics of accountability. The implication was clear. Powers higher than Whitmore had, at best, turn a blind eye, and at worst enable a culture where humiliating the ambitious was an acceptable method of teaching. I felt, in that moment, a cold clarity. This was not merely a roster of bad apples. It was a barrel filled with rot that had been left to fester because admitting fault would threaten funding, reputation, and careers. The cruelty had been institutionalized. We now had the leverage to demand structural change. Independent oversight of the district's interventions, transparent audits of IT activity, a restoration fund for students whose opportunities had been compromised, and mandatory training for staff on ethical mentorship. But leverage in law is not the same as finality on the street. The district would resist. Whitmore's defenders would marshal money and influence. The story would splinter into factions. In the quiet weeks that followed, Ethan began to rebuild in smaller, steadier ways. He returned to the robotics lab under supervision, but this time with his teammates who had pledged to make amends. He tinkered with a new arm design and laughed, small, genuine chuckles that felt like music after months of silence. Mrs. Ainsley helped him apply to a summer program at a nearby university. A scholarship application was drafted. It was not a headline. It was a life being patched up. And yet the horizon loomed. Our legal machinery had to land cleanly. Aisha prepared the discovery package that would be presented at the district hearing. Timelines, depositions, the archival memos Shelley had risked everything to share. We were ready to force the district's hand publicly, to compel resignations, policy changes, and reparations. But as we prepared for the hearing, Connor's family filed a counterclaim alleging defamation. Whitmore's attorney hinted at the possibility of a broader conspiracy against school staff, and the school board began to threaten to take the fight to media courtrooms. The noise rose. It was in that stormfront calm that I made a decision. I could push for punitive exposure that would end careers and satisfy a primal hunger for retribution. Or I could demand a hearing so thorough and public that the truth could not be distorted, one that would create an outcome bigger than revenge, an outcome that rewired the system, so the next Ethan wouldn't have to fight alone. I chose the latter. We prepared our case not as an act of vengeance, but as an act of design, building a legal scaffold upon which accountability could stand. The hearing would be the crucible. The district would be forced to show its records. Whitmore and Clarkson would answer in public. Parents and the press would be there. We would invite former students to tell their stories. We would demand the creation of an oversight committee. That night, as I sat on the back porch watching Ethan check the torque on a small motor, I realized how much had changed. The boy who had once been frozen on a stage was learning to move again. The fight was no longer only mine. It was ours. And when the hearing convened, we would not merely expose the wrongdoing. We would try to redesign the future. There was one more thing I could not ignore. In the depths of the recovered records, someone had quietly referenced a contractor, a name I'd not seen before. Horizon Education Consultants. I had a hunch that the consultants had supplied the language and the manuals used by Whitmore's team. If true, the corruption stretched beyond the district into entities that sold character building to cash-strapped schools. The hearing would have to include them, or any victory would be incomplete. So we sharpened the list of demands. We prepared witnesses. We fortified our legal filings. And we waited for the hearing date, aware that waiting in this phase was not passive. It was strategic. The next time the district doors opened for a public reckoning, we planned to walk in with every file, every witness, and every shred of proof. We would not only show what had been done to Ethan, we would show how it had been done, who profited from it, and how to stop it. The air smelled different now, less like humiliation and more like possibility. The next chapter would be loud, structured, and public. It would either break the system or force it to change. Either way, it would not leave Ethan's story to be whispered anymore. The district hearing room buzzed like a hive of angry bees. Parents filled the seats, reporters crowded back, and cameras blinked like unblinking eyes. Ethan sat between me and Aisha, posture stiff but head high. The boy who had once wilted under laughter was now standing in the center of his own redemption arc. Whitmore entered with his attorneys, composed yet pale. Clarkson followed, visibly nervous, and behind them Connor Hayes, his parents, dressed as if this were a routine parent-teacher conference. But it wasn't routine. This was Judgment Day. Aisha opened with precision. She presented the deposition footage, the damning behavioral calibration logs, the forgotten audit notes Shelley had safeguarded. Each document layered the same truth. What happened to Ethan wasn't an accident. It was part of a pattern. Students have been quietly sabotaged, humiliated under the guise of discipline. Their futures altered while adults congratulated themselves on teaching lessons. The room grew tense. Reporters scribbled. Parents gasped. Ethan's hands clenched, but his gaze never left the screen. Then Aisha called Ethan to testify. My son stood, voice trembling at first, then steadying. He described the night of the robotics showcase. The way laughter had filled the hall like fire, the cold certainty that everything he had worked for had been stripped away. He ended with words that silenced the room. I thought failure was mine to carry, but it was theirs. I just want no other kid to feel what I felt. That broke the last wall. Parents stood, clapping despite the chair's attempt to gavel silence. Former students stepped forward with their own stories. Projects mysteriously corrupted, scholarships lost, humiliation justified as tough love. The narrative was undeniable. Whitmore's defense crumbled. Under questioning, he admitted the consultants from Horizon Education had sold the behavioral calibration idea as character building. He claimed he only implemented it. But the emails revealed enthusiasm, not reluctance. Clarkson, cornered, admitted he had encouraged peer pressure lessons. His resignation was demanded on the spot. The board had no choice. They voted for an independent oversight committee, district-wide audits, restitution for affected students, and immediate termination of both Whitmore and Clarkson. Horizon Education was referred to the state attorney's office for investigation. For once, accountability wasn't delayed. As reporters swarmed, Ethan turned to me, eyes wet but smiling. Dad, it's over. I squeezed his hand. No, son, it's beginning. Now you get to dream again without fear. Weeks later, Ethan received acceptance into the summer robotics program. Full scholarship restored. His teammates, those who had once laughed, now stood beside him, working late nights to rebuild what had been broken. His laughter returned, no longer brittle but full, real. For me, revenge had transformed. I hadn't simply struck back at those who mocked my son. I had helped tear down a system that thrived on humiliation. My silence had once allowed cruelty to grow. But when I finally spoke, when I turned the tables, it wasn't only for Ethan. It was for every child whose dream had been dismissed as arrogance. And as I watched my son place the final screw in his rebuilt robot, I realized the tables hadn't just turned. They had been flipped, reset, and rebuilt into something new. Justice wasn't about crushing enemies. It was about ensuring that the laughter of cruelty would never again drown out the voice of a dreamer.